record to the cloud, and we are recording now. So I know I always get in trouble when I do sort of almost any bit of review, but it's helpful to do a little bit of review, even though last week was mostly review from what we did. So moving forward here, we've actually we've been in this study since, believe it or not, since last, I think, April. So we're coming up on a year. I think we'll have it finished up by about the end of April, first of May. I was looking ahead as I was doing some of the prep work yesterday. We're making good progress, and then there's some tying it all together stuff that we need to do at the end, but we're certainly getting there. So for the last, I guess, 6 to 8 weeks, we've been primarily, I have to resize my windows here since I started screen sharing so I can see what I want to see. There we go. We've primarily been using this chart, which sort of outlines the path of the various denominations. We're going down each one and sort of looking at these various breakpoints again to sort of understand what caused that breakpoint, because that normally should tell us something important theologically that ties into why things are different. So quick review here about 3 dates we're going to cover. You should know these like the back of your hand now, guys. 1517. What in the world happened in 1517? Not everybody at once.
Luther,
the tacking of the theses, or what we sort of consider to be the formal start of the Reformation. But I hopefully one of the things you've learned or gathered through this process is that's arbitrary in the sense of the fact that Wycliffe and Huss and some of the other things had actually been happening before. So 1517 marks what we formally consider the beginning of the Reformation. And again, we've talked about on this chart sort of the two breakouts here of the more traditionally reformed at the bottom, and then the later or lesser reformed or differently reformed at the top. So we'll continue to show that break. 1525.
The Anabaptists.
Represented here, it's the break off of the Anabaptists. Anybody remember who the Anabaptists were?
No infant baptism.
Correct. They were the ones who were advocates for adult believers only baptism, and that put them at odds, particularly with where they were there in what we now think of as being Switzerland. And the break off there, that leads to the Mennonites, the Hutterites, and the Amish as we know them. So that's the 1525 date, leading to the Anabaptist. 1534.
Henry.
The Act of Supremacy by Henry VIII, which declares that who's the head of the church in England? Henry is, not the Pope. And so that's where we see the break off of what eventually becomes the Anglican Church and then carries forward in a modern sense to also be in the United States, the Episcopal Church. Although we will come back and revisit this because there's another important break that comes up here in 1738 with the Wesleys and the break off into Methodism. And so today, again, we've been sort of working through this chronologically. So today we're going to land on 1536, which, as you can see from the chart, is the break off of Calvinists or the Reformed tradition from the rest of the Reformation that started in 1517. So what's so important about 1536 that we would recognize that as being the breaking point? What issue lies here at this point of division?
Predestination?
Predestination is part of the answer. And the reason we choose 1536 is because John Calvin published Institutes of the Christian Religion, which this is the first version of that. He actually updates and revises this document at least 3 times in a major way during his lifetime. But this is when this is published. It was and is still one of the most influential theological summaries that has ever been written. And it's in this work that Calvin lays out some of his thoughts regarding election. We talked about this a little bit last week and even the weeks before about we use the term predestination. And when we say that, what do we mean?
God predestined us before the foundation of the world.
Right. God. The key word there, and good to hear Donna's voice this morning. God predestined. The very fact of predestination is something only God is capable of doing, right? By the very nature of what it is. And so it's the idea that God was the first mover in our salvation. Now, the way that actually expresses itself in the book of Romans, where we often see it there, is we have the term that's used, which is called the elect. And we're going to spend a little bit of time this week talking about this, but we'll spend a lot more time talking about the concepts of predestination and the things that are wrapped up in what we broadly call Calvinism over the next few weeks, particularly as we look at what overlaps exist between Calvin's thought and Luther's thoughts and what differences exist between the two. Because their thoughts, for example, on predestination are not exactly the same. We also, I think it was last week, if not, it was in the last couple of weeks. When you hear the term Calvin or Calvinism, what do you think? Well, predestination, right?
Yeah.
So you may be familiar with the acronym TULIP, which is used to sort of outline the 5 points that are normally associated with quote unquote Calvinism. The main point I want to make here, because we're also going to circle back around with this, is that we use that term rather loosely. In fact, we use that term incredibly loosely now compared to what it may have meant even 150 years ago or certainly 300 years ago. There was nobody running around during Calvin's day really saying, I'm a Calvinist. That's a term that we apply retroactively back to things that flow out of that part of the Reformation. And I think it was Doug who mentioned this last week or week before we talked about this. I know it often gets used in our modern sense as almost a pejorative. To be called a Calvinist in some circles is not exactly something that is a term of endearment. Would you all agree with that?
Yes.
So we do want to unpack and explore that a little bit. But 1536 is important because this is when Calvin publishes the Institutes of Christian Religion. I'm just hitting on some of the high points there because again, we'll come back to a lot of this over the next couple of weeks. It was published in 1536 in Basel, which is actually in part of what we know today as Switzerland. Part of what I've learned a lot over the last 3 to 4 weeks is better understanding the Swiss and the relationship with France and Italy. This is before Switzerland, as we know it, has been formed, but it's the area that eventually will become Switzerland. And it's actually dedicated to Francis I, who's the King of France. We'll talk about why that is. The first edition was only 6 chapters in length, but by the time of the last edition, which is in 1559, that's been expanded up to 80 chapters. A total of 10 editions were actually written by Calvin or edited by him between 1536 and 1560, both in Latin and French. And the structure of this, it is almost the first systematic theology, except it's not. But it's probably one of the most well-known early ones. Its structure was originally based on the Apostles' Creed. So it basically was going through the Apostles' Creed and unpacking that. So it was also strongly rooted in Scripture. And Calvin is very influenced by Augustine. A lot of Augustinian thought that's in there in the early church fathers. And it's by far considered the most influential book of the Reformation. Predestination and some of the concepts around salvation and justification are some of the most important thoughts of the Reformation. But in terms of an individual book, it's hard pressed to actually pick a more impactful book, both during that time and carrying forward. I was looking last night to get a free version of it on my Kindle because it's in the Kindle Unlimited section for Amazon. And there was nothing short of 400 and some odd different versions of paid and free of institutes of the Christian religion. So it's still published and in the popular domain today. Has anybody ever read anything from the institutes?
No,
Never
I
even
haven't.
heard of it until yesterday.
I may have in college, but I don't remember.
I can honestly say that until last night, I had never read directly. I'd read stuff about it, but never read it. But it's also known for sort of its organizational structure and its clarity. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through it, because we're not going to spend the whole class time today focusing on it, because we'll come back to it regularly, but understanding why it's the watershed moment, which is why that break off there is in 1536 on the chart, but also it's by far the most influential thing that Calvin did. So before we start talking about who John Calvin is, aside from Calvinism, what do you know about John Calvin?
Nothing.
All of that.
Heard
He
somebody
was
say
one.
that
He
name.
was a reformer.
He was a reformer. Most often when we think of the Reformation, there's two big figures that we think of. We think of Luther and we think of Calvin. There were others. Zwingli. When we get down into actually looking more at the how Lutheranism moved forward, we're going to see that while Luther started rolling the ball, there were others, Melanchthon, some of the others that were there. And even after Calvin, there's Beza that follows him and some others that are there. But the two big figures of the Reformation are Luther and Calvin. Luther is the older of the two, and Luther is sort of the more famous of the two, if for no other reason than the 1517 95 Theses tacking on the door. But that, I think it's arguable that while Luther certainly was a tremendous force in the Reformation, most of the lasting, enduring parts of the Reformation, the majority of that actually flows out of what happened with respect to Calvin. What nationality is Calvin?
Not sure.
We know Luther is German.
He's French.
He's French. But what gets confusing about that is that most of his life and most of his work does not take place in France. Most of it's in what we think of as being Switzerland, and most of that actually in Geneva, because Switzerland is the cantons there are really like large extended city states. And so he's French. Most of where things happen for him is what we think of as being Swiss. And so that's easy to think that it's easy to think that a lot of the people that were in Switzerland during the Reformation were Swiss. They weren't. Most of them actually were from France, heavy influence and a lot of interaction between France and Switzerland. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. Anything else that anybody just knows about him off the top of their head before we sort of go through his biography a little bit? All right. That's actually the reason for doing this then, is to know a little bit more about him. I apologize for the density of this timeline, and we're not going to hit every point of it, but it's one of the better ones that I've found that sort of covers everything. And so first of all, Calvin's born in 1509. So Calvin is only 8 years old when we have the formal start of the Reformation with Luther's attacking of the Theses.
Me to let you out.
So that's important. He's basically almost a generation behind Luther, or at least most of a generation behind. So he's French, and at the age of 14, his parents are somewhat well-to-do. He goes off not to study theology in Paris, but he actually goes off to study law. He is a lawyer by training, and he's also what's known as a humanist prior to his conversion. So when I use the word humanist, what is that?
Everything revolves around man.
Okay,
Other
around
than
man. The humanists were a group of were sort of a category of students for about 100 to 150 year period of time. And what they're mostly known for is sort of this is part of the Renaissance. So it's the rediscovery of the Greek and Roman classics and classical language, classical literature, and classical thought. So what education worked, it's a bit scary. Can y'all hear me?
It bleeped off for a second.
Yeah, that's weird. Why did that do that? Y'all can still hear me though, correct?
Yes.
Everybody just check in with me because I lost all my video.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to come back in. That's just weird. Okay. I don't think I've ever had that happen on a Zoom meeting before, but that's okay. We'll roll with it. It used to not be there. Okay. I'm not going to worry about it. Here. All right. Sorry for getting a little messed. It's just when you suddenly lose your lose your video. It's a weird thing. There we go. So he is, while he's studying law, he's training to be a lawyer, but he's also in the camp or the school of the humanists. And so that becomes important because he has familiarity with the classical languages directly, so Latin, for example, and he also has familiarity with classical literature, classical thought. So he comes from that background as he's coming into as a student. He goes on to the college in Orleans to study law directly. His father dies in 1531. And in 1532, he publishes his first work, which is a commentary on the Roman writer Seneca on just something that was written in that period of time. So it's not, there we go. Now my video's back. Is that his first writing is not a religious writing. It's actually a commentary on a secular classical work. What's going on in France during this particular time by 1532 is there is starting to be clashes between a predominantly Catholic France and the Protestant elements that are within France. And particularly under the French king, Francis I, there's a lot of strife going on. And it's during this period of time, about 1533, that Calvin and one of his friends flee Paris. And sometime in this particular period, and we don't have a lot of good detail on this, Calvin undergoes his conversion and he becomes not only a more adamant Christian, he was raised in the Catholic tradition, just because everyone was, but he goes through a conversion to Protestantism. And the mention here is a sudden conversion. Is a pretty dramatic thing that happens in his life. That happens in 1533 and 1534. He resigns his access to some of the things that his family has, to the benefices that are there. And he ends up he's in France, but in this particular point in time, the French Protestants are under a tremendous amount of pressure and persecution from the French crown.
Real quick, I've got to clarify something. You said he was raised in the Catholic tradition, but he was a humanist.
Yeah, there was nothing. Humanist there doesn't carry the connotation of not being a believer. It's just that the humanists were very much focused on studying classical literature, studying classical writings. So this was, in fact, Erasmus, about a century before, had also been a Christian writer who was one of the first humanists.
But I thought you said a humanist revolves around man. That how can humanists revolving around man still believe in God?
Donna mentioned the focus of humanism more on man than on God. what's the best way to describe this? There were humanists who were nominal believers. And so there was the idea of humanism that was I don't want to say atheistic, but that was not Christian in its origin. But there were Christian humanists. He converts to Protestant faith in this 1533 time frame. It's not long after that, as you can see in 1536. By the way, they flee Paris. Where they end up in is Switzerland. So let me give a little bit of background there.
Don, I have a question. When you say he resigns his two benefices, what are those?
Those are positions that related to his family fortune and his family responsibilities. He was the things that have been provided to him as a benefactor, provided by his father when he died.
So he basically gave up his inheritance?
He gave up good portions of his inheritance.
So they had nothing to do with positions in the church.
These were not positions in the church. That is correct.
Okay.
And what was the reason he gave those up?
Because of his conversion. And the fact that they were back in France and they had to flee from France.
Okay.
So Geneva in particular, but basically all of Switzerland during this period of time sort of becomes the place that is most well known for where a lot of Protestant refugees, Switzerland had become like a large extended Protestant refugee camp, is the way that I think of it in my head. Geneva was one of those places. Bern was one of those places. Not all of what we think of as being Switzerland, not all of those cities were Protestant. Some of them remained Catholic. There was a mixture there in Switzerland. But Calvin ends up in Geneva. And that becomes very important because that is going to be where he is and where he isn't for the balance of his life. And we'll talk a little about that as we move through. So once he's there, he comes in contact with particularly these are some of the more radical elements of the Reformation as well. If you remember back when we were looking earlier, this break off in 1525, the break off for the Anabaptists, where did that happen? That happened in Switzerland. And so this was, in fact, it happened in Geneva. So this is an area that's sort of a hotbed and a collection point for much of Protestant thought. So Calvin finds himself as a newly converted Protestant in the middle of the grand central station of what's going on with Protestant thought. And his training has been as a what? What is he?
Lawyer.
He's a lawyer. And he's already a writer. In fact, he's known for writing like a lawyer, writing a treatise type of thing. And so early on, as he comes in contact with and becomes to understand the theology of the Protestant of the Reformation, that's what he looks to put down in writing in the Institutes of Christian Religion. So the first edition, again, based on the Apostles' Creed and explaining things out through that, is Calvin's first work there in 1536. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Do you remember the other big thing about the Anabaptists that were separate from the fact that they were believers in credo baptism, not infant baptism? Do you remember the other big difference, the other big point that we talked out other than the baptism question with the Anabaptists? Do you remember what the other big thing was that was an issue for them?
Authority.
Authority. Remember, the question here resides on whether or not who has the authority of the state or the church, right? We talked about why that was important with the Act of Supremacy in 1534 in the English Reformation, Henry making that declaration. Here's what's important to understand is that in Geneva, Who basically runs the church? It's the city council. There is a direct correlation between the political apparatus and the church apparatus in Geneva and in many of the Swiss city-states. So when Calvin arrives in Geneva, it's primarily Protestant with different flavors of it going on. They've already had approximately 10 years before the Anabaptist break off. That happened in Geneva as well. Calvin is in the middle of this fervor, is the best word I know to describe it, about what's going on in Switzerland with respect to Protestant thought and the Reformation. But there also is a lot of vying in politics and control that's happening here. And so the long story short is Calvin shows up in 1534. He's persuaded to stay by a friend of his named Farel to remain in Geneva. By 1538, he's come to Geneva, and Calvin and Farel are actually banished from Geneva. He is kicked out of Geneva. So this becomes an important thing because he's kicked out because of, partly candidly because of his personality and the way that he tends to be pretty combative over issues, but also because there's a lot going on there and he's in disagreement with the authorities in Geneva. And the authorities in Geneva have a tremendous amount of control in terms of what's happening within the church. So Calvin's first stay in Geneva is important. It's from there that we actually get the writing of the Institutes of Christian Religion, but it's fairly short-lived, 3 to 4 years. In 1538, he's out of there. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
He leaves there to go to Strasbourg, where he ends up being a pastor to a French-speaking congregation there. In fact, they call the church that he founds there the Little French Church in Strasbourg. And he's there for a period of time. That's actually where he meets his the woman that will become his wife, who's a widow. Her name is Idolette. She happens to be the widow of an Anabaptist. And so there are some things that sort of come in from her thoughts about theology that have some influence on Calvin. And what we see here is that he's sort of sent into exile. Calvin leaves Geneva to go to Strasbourg, and then he's actually invited back to Geneva in 1541. And part of the reason that he's invited back is what he wrote back in 1536. The Institutes of Christian Religion, because of the printing press, because of being distributed, is sort of blown up. And it's become a big part of what's going on inside of the Reformation movement. And Calvin has become something of a leader, definitely something of a celebrity inside of the movement. And so he's welcomed back to Geneva in the latter part of 1541. He will be in Geneva for the balance of his life and will be both a leader there and primary mover and shaker in the church in Geneva. Has anybody ever heard any of the controversial stuff about Calvin in Geneva?
Don't think so.
Okay. Depending upon who you read, Calvin tends to be a very polarizing figure. And so he comes back into the church in Geneva, and most of the clergy in Geneva are not the level of formally trained that he is. And so one of the things that he does early on is really establish more formal education for those that are leading the various congregations that are there inside of Geneva. But again, it's that very strong, the council there in Geneva is very strong. And so sometimes people refer to Calvin as the Pope of Geneva at some point because it's a very strict, highly regimented, a lot of rules and laws regarding proper social behavior, other things like that. In fact, Geneva actually turns into being something of a theocracy. It's ruled, the city council had ruled the church, the church sort of takes control of the city council, and now the church and the council combined are ruling Geneva. And so Calvin essentially, there's some who would actually call him a dictator almost in Geneva. Others just say he was carrying forth what he believed was the right theology and position to have and the right social positions. It just so happened that's the way that Geneva was structured. But you will hear different things and different modes of thought about how strong and powerful Calvin was in Geneva. His thoughts were being spread very widely around all of Christendom, but particularly the Protestant world. 1553, this guy named Servetus is burned at the stake for heresy. We can literally spend a whole class talking about this whole event, but this guy named Servetus, who's actually well known, he was a doc, like so many of these folks from the Renaissance. He was a doctor and a writer and a theologian. He's sort of best known for being one of the early folks to identify how the pulmonary system worked and documented that. Over the period of time before 1553, he and Calvin had been in this letter exchange going back and forth. At least one of the resources I was listening to and watching yesterday said that it almost probably reached the point that Servetus was almost like a stalker for Calvin at some point. It eventually reaches the point he has some very unusual thoughts about the Trinity. Remember way back when we talked about Arianism, this idea of whether Christ was truly God or not. He has some thoughts that are sort of interpreted as being more along Arian type thoughts. Certainly he wasn't a traditional Trinitarian. So bringing a long story short, eventually he ends up in Geneva and he's been charged with heresy. And what ultimately happens to him in Geneva is that he's burned at the stake for his heretical beliefs. And the interesting thing about this story is there were plenty of other Protestants in Switzerland, what we think of as Switzerland today, and others who wanted to do the same thing. It just all fell in Geneva under Calvin's watch. And so historically looking back, this is one of the lenses that Calvin is viewed through, is that he allowed this person to be burned for heresy in Geneva under his watch. And so some of the negative that goes back towards Calvin is a lot of it is centered around this event, but also just how strong the control was of the church there in Geneva. Does all that make sense? It's sort of hard to do the 5-minute thumbnail sketch of that because it's a long, convoluted story of this relationship between Servetus and Calvin and how it reaches this point.
I'll have to go back and listen. I had to go answer the door.
Okay.
It seems like
So there's a lot of people that sort of is one of the last things that happens in Calvin's life. So that's in some ways the way that he's sort of looked at by certain folks towards the end of his life. Ultimately, in 1559, he produces the final edition of the Institutes, and he establishes an academy there in Geneva, a theological seminary, if you will. And finally, in 1564, Calvin dies. Don't feel like I did that timeline justice. Anybody have any questions about that? He was, what interesting thing, preached almost every day when he was in Geneva. Even when he was older and couldn't really stand, they had a special chair that he sat in and preached from, about an hour sermon every day. In Geneva, you were required to go to church on guess which 2 days of the week?
Sundays and Wednesdays.
Sundays and Wednesdays. So part of what we even have in terms of modern tradition behind the idea of a midweek service flows out of this tradition that was happening there in Geneva. And sort of just a real quick summary here. I mentioned Francois I, who was the monarch in France at the time that Calvin fled from France. And again, he had a humanistic education, a lot of emphasis on the scholars. He knew a number of different languages and studied as a lawyer. The first edition of the Institutes and subsequent editions of the Institutes were actually dedicated to Francois, sort of trying to hope that he would eventually see the light in terms of understanding the theology that was there. And I didn't mention this, but he's very much considered to be the theological heir of Zwingli, who was one of the early reformers who dies around 1530. And so Calvin sort of inherits the leadership there in Switzerland over time. And again, Geneva at the time when Calvin arrives there is very much a lot of expelled Catholics, but also the Protestants that have come there as well. And then actually in Geneva, he becomes again the leader that's there. And eventually Geneva is sort of referred to as the Holy City, what I was just talking about here, this idea that it actually sort of became a theocracy. By the time of the last version of Institutes in 1559, it had grown to being 1,500 pages. And again, as is mentioned here, it was really designed to be a formal training for the Reformed clergy. So he wanted to have something that was durable, that could be given so that there would be an educated clergy.
Okay, so I know he was a lawyer, but how did he live? Where did he get his money from? Church, from his political, whatever position he had, or was it law or what?
The second time that he's back to Geneva, remember he got kicked out the first time. The second time that he's back, they welcome him back with open arms. In fact, they give him a house and they give him a salary. In fact, he was actually making more than some of the town officials were there in Geneva. So early on, he gives up some of the family wealth and some of the family options that are there. But when he's invited back in 1538, he actually becomes taken care of by the city.
And what was his position?
He was essentially the leader of the congregation of churches there in Geneva. One of the Ryan Reeves, and I really recommend Ryan Reeves stuff. I have the links to those on the Sunday School page. Talked about that they sort of opened the door for Calvin to be in Geneva what Luther was in Wittenberg. He was sort of the reformer in residence, if you will, because of his prestige and the fact that he had grown to be a leader in the movement. So they were offering him a housing package and a salary package to make sure that, we know we kicked you out, but please, 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 please come back to Geneva.
So it says both Catholics and Protestants who disagreed with him were persecuted.
Yeah.
What?
I want to hit on this. Of course, a lot of these slides I borrow from places that I find on the internet, but this is important. This particular period, we talked about this before, the 30 Years' War is all of this. We talked about the persecution under Mary in England, the persecution. It was not the persecution of the Anabaptists. Remember how they were being executed? By drowning. Persecution was sort of the word of the day there for about the better part of that century. Religious persecution, religious wars went on, and it worked both ways. It wasn't just Catholics that were persecuting those that were part of the Reformation and the Reforming. There was equally atrocities and persecution that were going on by Protestants back towards Catholics. It was a dangerous time to hold religious beliefs that were contrary to those who had power, and who had power shifted somewhat frequently there. And Calvin, as you'll notice here, it says both Catholics and Protestants who disagreed with Calvin were persecuted. You might see that sentence and go, wait a second, there were Protestants that disagreed with Calvin? The answer is yes. We have this idea that the Reformation was all just one big, there was the Catholic Church, and then there was the Reformation, and there were two big camps, but inside of the Reformation camp, there were a lot of subdivisions in terms of the different thoughts that were there. And so, for example, Servetus, who was executed, was a Protestant. You can even argue to some degree he shared many of Calvin's views, but he was still actually executed by whom? The folks in Geneva who were definitely Protestants. Questions? So the other term that is used to describe the Calvin branch of the Reformation, does anybody know what that word is?
What was that question?
Does anybody know what the other word that's used to describe Calvin's branch? We don't necessarily refer to it all as Calvinism. Does anybody know what the other word that we use is? I'll kick us back here. Notice that it is Reformed.
Oh, okay.
So we apply the term Calvinist to describe, or Calvinism to describe parts of that, but the way that most scholars will use the term now, including religious scholars, is to refer to Reformed theology. So this is where the term can also get a little tricky, because is Luther's theology Reformed theology?
Yes.
It's certainly a form of Reformed theology. It's the Reformation, after all, right? But this term Reformed gets a more narrow meaning as the Reformation moves forward. And we'll talk about this when we come back and hit the Lutherans, this other branch next week, is that it gets a more narrow definition to talk more about the things that are flowing more out of the Calvinist branch of the Reformation versus just the Reformation in general. So when you say Reformed theology today, to most modern religious theological scholars, they're talking more about this more, the narrower definition is normally what they're referring to, not necessarily everything that came out of the quote unquote Reformation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So here's the other thing, is that Calvinism, while primarily having its root location primarily in what we think of as being modern day Switzerland, it didn't stay there. So it ends up spreading to Scotland and then ultimately into England in the form of what eventually we will come to know or think of as being the Puritans. We'll get to that as well. That's another important branch of this. And so the other place that it spreads back into, and I think I deleted the slide for this, is, remember we talked about in French history, there's this group called the Huguenots. Those
Yes.
are French Protestants, and they are primarily along the lines of more of a Calvinistic theology. So what you end up with is sort of this very important thing of where Calvinism doesn't stay contained just to what we think of as being modern day Switzerland. It has routes and inroads into other places. Probably the most famous of those actually now connects to the Scottish Reformation and somebody by the name of John Knox. So, quick biography on John Knox. He's born in Scotland 5 years or so after Calvin. So he's of that generation of Calvin. Notice 1514, so that's only 3 years before Luther. So he's not during the period of Luther. Ends up graduating from the University of St. Andrews in 1536, and he's ordained a priest. So now he's inside of the Anglican Church. This is post 1534. The Anglican Church, it's really the Scottish Catholic Church. It hasn't really become the Anglican Church yet. And so he's a Catholic priest. He becomes a notary, so he's a tutor, so he's an educated person. He's serving in some minor governmental roles. He converts to Protestantism in 1543, and he ends up being, his conversion to the Protestant cause is during the period of time that we're having the persecutions that actually happen under Mary. And so he ends up moving into England. He ends up becoming a pastor there, and he ends up by 1553 being forced into hiding when Mary Tudor, Mary the First, becomes queen. So when he's forced into hiding, eventually what happens to him, and of course he has a whole other big thing here. I'm going to skip over this now, where he was captured while he was in Scotland, and he was basically a slave or a prisoner on a French galley. So he has to row for like 18 months. Eventually he escapes, ends up in a religious location. He's hiding there. But the key thing to understand is he eventually is forced into hiding in England when Mary comes to power. Remember, we talked about this before. When Mary comes to power and brings back Catholic theology, what happens to a lot of the Protestants?
They die.
They die, or they flee and go to Europe. And so while they were familiar with what was going on in the Continental Reformation, a lot of them had not had direct contact. Well, what happens now, and John Knox is a great example of this, he actually has to go, he flees to France and ultimately ends up in Zurich and then ultimately in Geneva, where a lot of the other English Protestants end up going during this period of time that's sometimes referred to as the Marian exile, the 5 years that she's actually in power there. And so you have a number of these English pastors who are Protestant leaning in their thought, who interact with the Protestant leaders in Europe. And so at the time when Mary's reign is over in 1558 and they come back, what do they bring back with them? They bring back some new additional thoughts about the Reformation. And for example, one of the things that happens while they're over in Europe is, do we continue to use what had first been brought out underneath Edward, that Book of Common Prayer? Do we continue to do that, or do we practice the liturgy and the service that of the people that we've been around, for example, in Geneva? So more of that style of worship. And so he comes back to Scotland, because that's where he's from originally, and brings back with him Reformed thoughts. He also writes an interesting little book in 1558. Because remember, how are kings and queens, how do they derive their authority? We talked about this over the last couple of weeks.
Through birth, through heritage.
Through heritage, through birth, and they are God ordained, right? Divine right of kings.
Right.
So while Mary is Queen of England, there are those in the Protestant movement who begin to say, does the Bible advocate the overthrow of an ungodly or an unjust monarch? And there's different modes of thought on this inside of the Protestant movement. Again, this is the relationship between church and state. So eventually, Knox ends up writing a book called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. I do not own a copy of that book, because having that on my shelf would probably get me in trouble just by its title alone, right? So what Knox ends up doing is, instead of making the case, which a lot of scholars would argue that he wanted to make, that you could overthrow any monarch if they held an unjust position relative to Scripture, he mainly focuses it on the fact that what gender is the Queen of England in 1558? It's Mary. She's a Catholic and she's female. And so he writes this book pamphlet, which argues that it's okay to overthrow an unjust, ungodly female monarch. And in this case, he's primarily targeting Mary the First of England. There's also a female monarch through the regency and what's been set up in Scotland. This gets him into a lot of hot water, but it also puts him in a position where he's thrust into leadership against the existing rule in Scotland. And so he ends up returning to Scotland there in 1559 and ends up leading a rebellion. And so he ends up leading the Reformation Parliament. This is the Scottish Reformation Parliament, which adopts a written confession, the Scottish Confession, the Scots Confession. His first wife dies, and then he ends up writing the first book of discipline when Scotland becomes Protestant, and then they're fighting against the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. So eventually Knox becomes known for being the primary mover and shaker of the Reformation in Scotland, or the Scottish Reformation. And eventually he dies in 1572. So where did Knox's, where did his theology, what was his theology influenced by? He was influenced by the time that he spent in Calvinist Reformed Geneva. And so Reformation theology comes to Scotland, not just only because of John Knox, but primarily because of John Knox. And what modern denomination do we have that flows out of that?
Presbyterian.
Right. Presbyterians are Scottish, are the Reformed Church in Scotland. If you want to get more detail on that, Bruce Gore does an excellent job of going through this, since he is a Presbyterian when he gives the tradition there. But actually what you end up with is what I will dub, this may be unique to me, but what you see here is this is basically how Europe is divided among Catholics and Protestants in 1555. So this is late in Calvin's life. You'll notice that still much of Europe is in the green. It's Catholic. The Lutheran strongholds are primarily where? In what eventually will become Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, and then up into Scandinavian countries. Anglicans are almost exclusively in England. But notice the Calvinist influence. Heavy in what we think of as being Switzerland. It's heavy in Scotland, and then it's also heavy in what we think of as the Netherlands or Holland or the Dutch territories. What you want to call this also changes over time. And so what you end up with is this sort of Calvinist Reformed axis that sort of establishes itself. Heavy influence in Switzerland, heavy influence in Scotland. That's from Knox bringing it back. And then we'll talk about this later. There's a very heavy Dutch influence to Reformed thought. There's also some Eastern European moving over actually into Poland as well. But then the other branch of this axis goes back to, there's Switzerland, there's the Netherlands, there's Scotland. But the other branch goes over to France. So again, remember, Calvin was a Frenchman. And so now the influence back into France, these are the Huguenots. And so Reformed theology has spread throughout Europe into Scotland, Scotland being one of the strongholds now, but also having a heavy influence in the Netherlands and still having adherents over in France. Notice that there's not one unified Reformed church that is both Luther and Calvin. They are still divided in terms of what's going on here. We talked before about the Anabaptist movement, even moving further to the east. We talked about when we covered them because of what was happening there. Questions about this?
Hey, Don, the question I had last week, Berean, what I meant was the brethren, and I see them on the map there.
Yeah.
It was predominantly in the Bohemian, Moravian area.
Yeah, and they flow out of the century before Jan Hus. For the most
The
part.
Hussites.
Yeah, the Hussites. But I did go look up Berean, which has an interesting connotation. It's often used to describe, because it's referenced there in Thessalonians, to the Berean church, or actually in Acts as well. But there also is a modern sect known as the Bereans, which tend to be part of the oneness movement. So they deny the Trinity as we traditionally know it. So there's two flavors of Bereans out there. most of the churches that you would see that identify themselves in Houston as a Berean fellowship are not that oneness denying the divinity of Christ view, but that is a modern offshoot that has adopted that name, the Berean name.
So are Presbyterians today 5-point Calvinists?
They are much more inclined to be Reformed or Calvinist in their theology than almost any other Protestant denomination. In some ways, the most powerful way that Calvinist thought has survived in an organized fashion that we would recognize it today are through Presbyterians. So the French guy who went to Switzerland influenced Scotland, and Scotland ends up being the primary thing that's a mover and shaker for Reformed thought. Not the only thing. There's others out there that certainly would consider themselves Reformed. Modern Reformed theologians, Sproul, to some degree MacArthur, some of the others are going to be in that tradition as well. But as a denomination, primarily Presbyterians. Again, I've talked about the importance of this dotted line here, because that Scottish Reformation and the tradition that's going on with that will feed its way back into England and have an influence on the Anglican Church as time moves forward. And that's what's going to lead to probably the next, after we look at the Lutheran branch here, the next break we'll talk about is that 1607 break. Well, who are these Congregationalists? Well, this is where we get in the inside of the English church, this group known as the Puritans, or the other way that's conformists and non-conformists, Congregationalists. Some of the things where this is the Scottish Reformation influencing itself back into and most notably when that happens is when Elizabeth dies. And so Elizabeth dies with no heir. James VI of Scotland is invited to become James I of England. So that brings even more of the Protestant bend from Scotland back to England. That's going to become important because one of the primary ways that you would identify or understand how Baptists come into being is understanding how they flow off of that congregational break inside the Anglican Church and through the Puritans and others that break off in this direction, picking up some of the thoughts that come from Anabaptists. So there's an intermingling of several of the thoughts that are here. So there's more of the Calvinist Reformed tradition influencing the Anglican Church, influenced by Anabaptists, that end up coming into the path of what we know as Congregationalist and then modern Baptist. Piece of cake, right?
For you.
Not for me. Because again, it's also not as clean and easy as all of the simple breaks on a chart here either. There's a lot more influence that's going on in subsets that are even happening. I think because you can see this was just a different map. I didn't use this one because it's so much busier, but it tells you a lot. This is Reformation Europe at the time of Calvin's death in 1564. These are all sects of both of Protestantism as well as Catholicism. To say that Europe is a little bit divided over religion is something of an understatement, right?
Yeah.
And as you can see, this one's a little bit different than the one that we just saw before, which makes things pretty easy, which is why I used it. As you can see, there are pockets inside of of what's going on here. Inside of France, predominantly Catholic, but a lot of Huguenots. Most of the Holy Roman Empire is leaning towards Lutheran thought, but there's still areas of Catholic thought. In the next century, in the 17th century, we're going to be talking about this because this is where Arminianism and Calvinism are going to come into clash here in the Netherlands. There's a lot of interaction that goes on here between Catholics and Protestants all throughout the areas that we think of today as being the Netherlands, Amsterdam, what's called Holland, which is one of the 14 segments inside of the Netherlands, and even down in Italy, which is predominantly Catholic, there are some other influences that are happening down there as well. But you can see inside of England, mostly Anglican, but there is a fairly large Reformed nexus that's inside of England at that particular time. So what we would pick up on next week, I'll just tease it, is we're going to talk about Luther and Calvin, because to me one of the questions is, why didn't they had enough in common? Why didn't this just become a combined Reformed church in contrast to the Catholic Church? And there's a reason for that, because there were notable theological differences between Calvin and Luther. So the easiest way to talk about that is we go down the path of looking at this path here, the Lutheran path, is to pick up the differences between these two. Questions, thoughts? All right. I'm going to stop the recording.